It was the kind of night that made Harlem streets hum with tension, thick with the weight of history and the pulse of what was to come. The city had seen its share of betrayals, but none as personal as the one Bumpy Johnson had endured. The betrayal had been cold, calculated, and committed by someone Bumpy had once trusted, someone who had sat at his table, shared his business, and called him a friend. Yet for all that closeness, when the time came, the man had chosen money over loyalty. And for 11 long years, Bumpy Johnson let him think he had escaped. He let the man live in peace, convinced that the sins of the past had been forgotten. But Bumpy Johnson never forgot. The atmosphere at the Harlem restaurant was electric with murmurs and hushed conversations, the air thick with anticipation as Bumpy entered. The crowd parted before him, not out of fear, but out of respect. The moment he stepped inside, everything shifted. His reputation filled the room before his feet even touched the floor. At table 7, the betrayer sat. He was nervous, fidgeting with his drink, glancing around in the way that only someone who thought they were being watched could. 11 years had passed since that fateful day when he had made the mistake of crossing Bumpy Johnson, but the weight of the betrayal had never lifted from his conscience. Tonight, there was no more running. There would be no more hiding behind the years. Bumpy's eyes met his across the room. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The man's face went pale. The room held its breath. The final reckoning had arrived. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a name. He was a figure woven into the very fabric of Harlem. Born in 1905, he rose from the shadows of poverty and hardship, carving out a reputation as a kingpin who understood both the streets and the men who ruled them. Harlem was his kingdom, and to survive in Harlem, you had to know the rules. Bumpy had earned his place at the top through a blend of ruthless ambition, sharp intellect, and an understanding of loyalty that ran deeper than the street deals he brokered. Harlem in the early 1930s was a place of both promise and peril. The Harlem Renaissance had fueled cultural progress, but at the same time, the streets were rife with crime, gang wars, and competition for power. The police were either too corrupt or too indifferent to clean up the streets, and political figures were often in the pockets of the mobsters who controlled the city's underbelly. But Bumpy had managed to rise above it all, not just by being smarter than the next man, but by being a symbol of the streets themselves. To know Bumpy Johnson was to know the rules of Harlem. The code of respect was absolute, and loyalty was everything. It was a reputation he built not through fear, but through the understanding that if you crossed him, you would not live to regret it, at least not for long. When Bumpy moved, the world moved with him. The Italians in Little Italy, the politicians in City Hall, and even the cops knew his name. Bumpy wasn't just a part of the criminal world. He was the world. His influence stretched far beyond the confines of Harlem, a fact that many tried to ignore but few dared to challenge. His name was synonymous with both justice and revenge, and in the world he ruled, crossing him was a death sentence. But not everyone who betrayed him paid the price right away. Some men got away with it for a time. The man at table 7 had made the mistake of underestimating Bumpy Johnson. His name was Jerome, and once he had been one of Bumpy's most trusted men. He had been there when the empire was built, when the deals were made, and when the streets of Harlem began to hum with prosperity. But when it came time to show loyalty, Jerome had faltered. The betrayal was simple enough. He had sold information to a rival gang, exchanging secrets for a small fortune. It was the kind of betrayal that not only jeopardized Bumpy's position, but also put the lives of the men who depended on him at risk. For years, Jerome had been hiding in plain sight. He thought he had been clever, distancing himself from Harlem, changing his name, and finding refuge in the shadows. He thought Bumpy had forgotten, or worse, that Bumpy had moved on. He had lived in luxury, unbothered by the consequences of his actions. 11 years had passed, and still, no one had come for him. But Bumpy didn't forget. He never forgot. What Jerome didn't understand was that Bumpy's patience was as sharp as any blade. He allowed time to pass, knowing full well that his reckoning would come when it was least expected. For a decade, Bumpy had watched from the shadows. He had allowed Jerome to think he had escaped. But tonight, the final chapter of their story was about to be written. As Bumpy walked toward table 7, Jerome's face grew paler with each step. Bumpy's reputation had already arrived, and Jerome knew that there was no turning back. His palms were sweaty, his breath shallow. He had lived for so long without fear, but now, for the first time in over a decade, he felt it. Fear like a cold hand around his throat. Bumpy reached table 7, his presence commanding the room. He didn't need to speak to make the point clear. The razor blade, the very same razor he had used on men who had crossed him before, was resting silently on the table. Jerome looked at the blade, then up at Bumpy. You've had your revenge," Jerome stammered, his voice a mixture of desperation and disbelief. "I paid my dues. I thought you'd forgotten." Bumpy didn't flinch. "You don't get to decide when the dues are paid. You crossed me, Jerome, and now I'm here to collect." The entire room held its breath. The other patrons, the men who had witnessed Bumpy's rise to power, watched in silence. They knew this wasn't just a personal matter. It was a demonstration, a reminder, a warning. The tension at table 7 was palpable. The air had thickened with every passing second, suffocating all around it. The hum of Harlem's restless nightlife had disappeared into the background, replaced by the sound of Jerome's ragged breathing. The men at the tables surrounding them, the ones who had once shared drinks and stories with both Bumpy and Jerome, were now frozen in place, silent, wide-eyed, as if the very room itself was holding its breath. Jerome's eyes darted nervously from the razor on the table back to Bumpy's unyielding gaze. The years had passed, but it didn't matter. The betrayal was fresh, as if it had happened only yesterday. Jerome had once believed that time was his ally, that the memory of his actions had faded, that he could slip back into the shadows and fade from Bumpy's mind. But now, standing face to face with Bumpy, the weight of his betrayal crushed him. 11 years. Bumpy spoke slowly, his voice cold, controlled. "You thought you could just disappear, didn't you? Thought you could live in peace, make your money, and forget the price you put on your back the day you sold me out." Jerome swallowed hard, his throat dry as he tried to steady himself. He had been in tight spots before, but none like this. There was no negotiating here, no more words, no room for excuses. "You don't understand," Jerome said weakly, his voice trembling. "I was just trying to survive. It was business. You know how it is, Bumpy. You know it wasn't personal." Bumpy's lips curled into a slight smile. But it wasn't a smile of amusement. It was the kind of smile a predator gives when it knows its prey is already caught. Survival, Bumpy repeated, his words sharp. You think I care about your survival, Jerome? You think I cared about you when you sold me out? The room seemed to darken, the weight of Bumpy's words hanging over the table like a storm cloud. The betrayal was clear now, the reason for Bumpy's calculated silence all these years. Bumpy had allowed time to pass. He had let Jerome think he was safe. But Bumpy was a man who valued loyalty above all. And when that loyalty was broken, there was only one way to resolve it. Jerome reached out, his hand shaking as he grabbed for his drink, his eyes darting to the men around the room, hoping for some form of salvation. But no one moved. No one made a sound. In that moment, it was clear to him. He was alone. Bumpy's hand slammed down on the table, the sound of it echoing throughout the room. The force of the impact made Jerome flinch, and Bumpy's voice cut through the silence like a knife. You think I forgot? Bumpy's eyes glinted with an unrelenting fury. You think time could make me forget the man who tried to destroy everything I built? No, you don't get to walk away from that. You don't get to walk away from me. Jerome's heart raced. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. This was the moment. There was no more running, no more hiding. Bumpy had made sure of that. 11 years had passed, and yet, here they were. Bumpy's hand moved to his jacket pocket, his fingers closing around the cool metal of the razor blade. The glint of the blade caught the light as it was drawn slowly from its sheath. A momentary flash that held the attention of everyone in the room. Jerome's face turned pale. He wanted to speak, to beg, but his mouth betrayed him. He opened it, but nothing came out. There was no more bargaining, no more second chances. Just Bumpy, standing above him, razor in hand, a man who was about to deliver justice in the only way he knew how. You had 11 years to think about this, Jerome, Bumpy continued, his voice steady, unwavering. And now you're gonna pay for it. Jerome's breath quickened, his chest tightening as he looked at the sharp edge of the razor. His mind raced. There were no options, no escape. He had betrayed Bumpy for money, thinking the streets were full of endless opportunities. But there was no opportunity here. Only justice, only the inevitable. Bumpy didn't waste time. He didn't need to. With one swift motion, the blade flashed forward, cutting through the air with surgical precision. A thin red line appeared on Jerome's wrist, and he gasped in pain as the blood began to seep from the wound. It was the kind of cut that wasn't fatal, yet, but it was a clear warning. A reminder that this was just the beginning. The pain would come, the consequences would unfold, and Bumpy Johnson was the one who would ensure they were paid. For a moment, the entire room stood still, the air thick with the tension of what had just transpired. Jerome cradled his bleeding wrist, looking up at Bumpy in stunned disbelief. The other patrons, silent, waiting, watching, knew what this meant. The razor had spoken, and there was no turning back. The aftermath of Bumpy's action was almost immediate. The men in the room had witnessed something they would never forget. The weight of Bumpy's decision wasn't just about the blood that was shed. It was about the power that was reaffirmed. Justice had been delivered, and the message was as clear as the blade that had cut through the tension. Jerome's eyes were wide with shock, his hands still clutching his bleeding wrist. He had expected something, perhaps a threat, maybe even a confrontation. But he hadn't expected Bumpy to act so swiftly, so decisively. He hadn't expected the razor to come out so suddenly to show him the consequence of his betrayal. As Bumpy stepped back, the room seemed to exhale. The stillness was broken, but not by cheers, not by applause. It was broken by the quiet realization that justice had been done, and it had been done by Bumpy Johnson. "Get him out of here," Bumpy said, his voice cold and calm, as if this was a matter of business. "He's not worth the time." The men around the table didn't move immediately. They looked to each other, hesitant. But then one of them, an older man who had seen many deals, many moments of tension, stood up slowly. He walked over to Jerome, his face tight with concern, and gently helped him to his feet. No one made a sound as Jerome was escorted out, still clutching his wrist. Bumpy stood alone at the table, the razor still in his hand, its blade gleaming in the dim light. He didn't need to say anything else. The room had already understood the message. Bumpy wasn't a man of many words. He never had been. His actions spoke for him, and that was all that mattered. The events at Table 7 weren't just a moment, they were a milestone. For the men who witnessed Bumpy Johnson's cold justice, it was a reminder that Harlem, the streets, and the underworld were governed by laws more profound than any written in a book. They were laws of respect, of loyalty, and of consequences. And when those laws were broken, there was no running from the reckoning. Jerome's fate was sealed that night, not because of the physical wound, but because of the message Bumpy had sent. Justice wasn't just about taking down your enemies. It was about preserving the order that kept everything else in place. And that order was what Bumpy Johnson represented, a force of balance in the chaotic world of Harlem's underworld. After the incident, Bumpy's reputation as a man who couldn't be crossed became legend. Word spread quickly, as it always did in Harlem, and soon enough, the story of Jerome's betrayal and the cold, precise justice that followed was on the lips of every man, woman, and child who knew the streets. Bumpy had reminded everyone that loyalty wasn't just an expectation, it was a condition of survival. The price of betrayal was steep, and no one who had ever seen Bumpy Johnson act would dare forget it. For Bumpy, this wasn't about cruelty. It wasn't about making an example for the sake of showing off power. It was about loyalty, something Bumpy had learned long ago was the foundation of everything. The empire he'd built wasn't based on fear. It was based on trust. You betrayed that trust, and there would be a reckoning. It was as simple as that. Harlem's underworld was a tightly knit network, and Bumpy's actions solidified his place at its helm once more. Men who had once questioned his power, who had wondered if his grip on the streets had loosened, now looked at him with new eyes. They understood what they had always known deep down. Bumpy Johnson was untouchable. And now he had reminded them of the price of crossing him. But it wasn't just the criminals and gangsters who felt the shift in the air. The very community that lived in the shadow of Bumpy's influence took notice. For the everyday men and women of Harlem, Bumpy wasn't just a figure to be feared. He was their protector, their symbol of justice in a world where both the law and the criminals were often corrupt. They understood that Bumpy had done what no one else had the stomach to do. He had served justice. And in their eyes, it was a kind of justice that had been long overdue. The consequences of Jerome's betrayal echoed through the streets, reaching every corner of Harlem. The once untouchable betrayer was now a symbol of failure. The men who had once whispered his name with respect now avoided it like a curse. His connections, his business, his wealth, everything he had built in the 11 years he thought he had escaped, crumbled in an instant. He had been a footnote in the saga of Bumpy Johnson, and in the end, he had been the one to write his own ending. For Bumpy, the incident was another chapter in a life filled with power struggles, betrayals, and justice. But what made this moment different was the way it solidified his place as a living legend. He wasn't just a criminal kingpin, he was a man who ruled by an unshakable code. He wasn't the kind of man you could forget. Bumpy Johnson had delivered justice not for personal gain, but to ensure that the balance of Harlem remained intact. The streets, after all, had their own set of rules, and for those who lived by them, there was respect. For those who didn't, there were consequences. Years passed, and the world outside of Harlem changed, but Bumpy Johnson's legend continued to endure. His reputation wasn't built on the fleeting victories or the violent confrontations. It was built on his unyielding commitment to his code. In the streets of Harlem, respect meant more than anything else. And the men who followed Bumpy, the ones who operated in the shadows, knew that breaking that code came with a price. Even as the years turned and new players entered the game, Bumpy's name remained on the lips of everyone who understood the balance of power in Harlem. His legacy wasn't defined by the wealth he amassed, nor the enemies he made. It was defined by the one thing that set him apart from every other man who had ever walked the streets: his unwavering loyalty to the code of respect. Jerome became a cautionary tale, a man whose name was spoken in hushed tones to remind those who came after him that no one, no matter how far they thought they could run, was ever truly free from the consequences of betrayal. The men who had once thought they could betray Bumpy learned to think twice. And in the years that followed, those who crossed Bumpy didn't simply disappear. They faced the same reckoning that Jerome had. But Bumpy's influence wasn't confined to the criminal underworld alone. His legacy had ripples far beyond the streets of Harlem. Even the law, the men who had once tried to dismantle his empire, came to respect him. He had become a symbol not just of power, but of unwavering justice. In the world where justice was often a commodity for the highest bidder, Bumpy Johnson stood as a reminder that true justice came at a cost, and that those who betrayed it would eventually face the consequences. Bumpy Johnson's legacy was not written in the ink of newspapers or the headlines of history. It was written in the streets, through the lives he touched, the men he dealt with, and the respect he commanded. He was a man who didn't just rule Harlem, he defined it. His reputation wasn't built on fear or violence. It was built on a code of loyalty that resonated through every corner of his empire. The night Jerome thought he had escaped was the night that Bumpy Johnson reminded everyone that betrayal had a price. And that price was paid in full. In a world where power is often traded and respect is fleeting, Bumpy Johnson stood as a beacon of what it meant to honor your word. To walk a line between the criminal and the honorable, to protect your own, and to remind the world that loyalty, once broken, could never be forgotten. This wasn't just about one man's revenge. This was about the price of loyalty, the power of respect, and the unbreakable code that governed the streets. And in the world of Bumpy Johnson, justice wasn't just something to be delivered. It was something that would always come in its own time. And when it did, it would be unstoppable.